So I've taken a little bit of time, but we really need to talk about this Anthropic and Department of Defense situation. So hang with me for 1 minute. I'm Christopher Lind, and this is Future Focus. And this week, we're going to dig into this massive blowout between Anthropic, the U.S. Department of Defense, and OpenAI's opportunistic approach to the situation. But please, don't turn this off because of what you think this will be. It is my commitment that this will not be some rage bait podcast about who's right or who's morally superior or which team is best. I want to do a breakdown of specifically what happened so you can be informed about the situation, and then also talk about some practical applications that you can actually apply to your life and your business to ensure you don't find yourself in the exact same situation these big players are wrestling through right now. But before we get into it, if you enjoy my content, if you found value in it in the past, would you do me a favor and would you subscribe? If you know somebody who would benefit from it, please share this episode with them. You can also buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Christopher Lind, or check out my website where you can see all the different ways I can help you or your organization navigate the kind of wild text complexity we're talking about today. All right. So with that, let's get into this. And just so you know, here's the flow of the show. I'm going to break down just what happened and what's going on because there is noise everywhere, and a lot of it is fueled by personal opinions, political viewpoints, all this other stuff. And I just want to talk about what actually is happening so it doesn't seem like I'm sitting completely on the fence. I will share just some of my high-level perspectives on things that I think universally we should agree are problematic. And then I will get into the three things that I think we can actually all take action on, regardless of who you are. And then we'll close it out. So you should run about the usual thing. Now, if you don't know, you probably have seen headlines about the Department of Defense or Department of War and a big beef they're having with Anthropic, one of the big leading models in the AI world, and a lot of other details about why and who's doing what and all this other stuff. So here's what is going on. Back in July of 2025, the Pentagon awarded a $200 million contract to, really, it was kind of all the big AI companies. But Anthropic Cloud was integrated into their classified workflows. So they were the first ones to kind of go forward with this whole deal that the US government had with the big AI companies. And as part of that agreement, as part of that contract, the Department of Defense had agreed to Anthropic's acceptable use policy, kind of the standard terms and conditions that these AI companies have about what it means to use their product. That was back last summer. Okay. Then, in case you've lost sight with all the craziness, back in January with Operation Absolute Resolve, which was the whole Venezuela incident, there was a mandate that came from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth that mandated that all AI contracts adopt any lawful use language, which is basically we can use the tech for anything that is deemed legal. All right. So that's where the friction started, was in January over this whole thing, because the DoD, as part of that, said Anthropic would need to drop their UAP restrictions, which specifically called out mass surveillance and autonomous lethal force. So basically, in Anthropic's user agreement, they say our product cannot be used for mass surveillance or the autonomous life or death decision of another human being. Okay, that's what it was. And the DoD said we can't have any of that in there, which my guess is they thought would not be a big deal. They're the Department of Defense. I don't know. But CEO Dario Amodei from Anthropic said, no, we're not. we're not backing down on this. And he's made public statements about, in good conscience, we will not drop these safeguards. So essentially it created a stalemate, where the DoD and Anthropic went head to head over this whole how the AI could be used. And Anthropic has said, we're not backing down. And they got a deadline. They said, this is when you have to back down. They said no. And ultimately where it's landed was no, at which point the Trump administration ordered a full-on halt to any Anthropic use in the government. So basically the deal was out, and then they said, and on top of that, like, no one in the government can use Anthropic anymore. And then Hegseth took it another step further by labeling Anthropic basically a supply chain risk. It's a label that is usually reserved for foreign adversaries. So they basically slapped it with a label that makes them, at least in the eyes of some, a threatening company. It's basically a corporate time bomb. It's like, don't touch these people. Now, okay, that's what's going on there. Then in comes on the white horse, Sam Altman, who swooped in just right after OpenAI or Anthropic kind of said, absolutely not, we're not going to do this. And then the DoD did what they did. And he said, you know what, we'll do it. We'll do it. And Sam Altman's claim is, and we have the exact same Redlines as Anthropic. It's not, and I'll explain a little bit more, but basically he said that we do agree to the lawful purposes language. Basically is how he's getting around it, is he's saying, well, technically our UAP says that we don't allow it, but we're making a concession on the lawful purpose language, which pretty much lets the military define whatever is lawful. And he's also saying, well, and since we're a cloud-only platform, pretty much there's no way to make autonomous decisions on life or death things with our technology. So in Sam's mind, he has found a way to word it creatively to allow what clearly Anthropic CEO said, no, we in good conscience can't stand behind where this is going and what the plan is for using these things. So to be clear, I'm not suggesting necessarily that what Sam is doing is bad, but he's using linguistic and architectural workarounds. He's saying he's sticking to it while kind of leaving it to be very gray. Okay, so that's really what has happened. Hopefully I've kept that as objective and non-biased and just here's what actually is going on. But I do want to weigh in here on some of what I think the most important things to be thinking about or reacting to, because there's lots of reactions to things that I don't think are helpful. We can all have opinions on how we feel about Sam Altman and his ethics, or, Dario and how he's coming at this, or Pete Hegseth and the DoD. And I know there are opinions all across the board. And I just think a lot of them just end up lead to infighting over things that aren't helpful. But I also don't want to seem like I'm just Switzerland and I don't have a position on anything, but I think there's some things, because it's extremely complicated. So let me just take a few minutes to share my perspective on some of this. I think the Department of Defense, and really just any defense groups, this isn't just a US centric thing. So that's the other thing. This isn't just a US problem. I think many defense organizations and governments are moving way too fast with artificial intelligence in integration into their technology, integration into their systems, layering it into their data systems, all this stuff. And it's not just I don't like the idea of defense and things like that. It truly is. I know how vulnerable these systems are, how easily they can be exploited, and how frequently they make mistakes. And so when you start integrating that kind of stuff into something as serious and potentially like world shattering as geopolitics and lethality, the risks just go through the roof. Now, I'm not going to get into, is it good? Is it bad? Like, where do all those things go? Because honestly, the world of defense is not a simple thing. And I've done a decent amount of work in that space, and it's extremely complicated, and it's never as simple as the headlines would make you think. There are no easy decisions where you can just say, this is how it should be universally all the time, all this other stuff. And so that's why I'm hesitant to just say, well, should AI be used for surveillance? Should it not? That's a very big umbrella. Should it be used in the decision-making for a lethal decision or not? There's so much there and so many different situations. And that's why I say I'm not a fan of how quickly everybody is rushing to move forward with it. And I think in general, everyone needs to slow down. But if you're interested in me doing a deeper dive into AI and defense and some different case studies, use case scenarios, ways that we could be thinking about it, I'm happy to put that on the agenda. But I'm just saying in general, if you were to say, Christopher, how do you feel about AI and defense? I would say, I feel like we're moving too fast and not actually taking the time to understand the nuance and the criticality of how it could be used and the risks we're running by integrating it so quickly. I understand the world is on fire. Everybody's trying to beat everybody. So I understand why there's so much pressure. But I think we may end up making some very big mistakes that we all suffer for in our rush. Okay. So there's opinion number one. Number two, I do not approve or support what I would consider the precedent of overreach. I do not appreciate the current administration's choice to essentially weaponize not doing what we want. So I understand that Anthropic took a stand that in their mind, they felt very strongly about. The DoD disagreed and felt, well, what did you think we were going to do? Like, I don't know the ins and outs of how the contract broke down or who thought what or what was clearly communicated, but at any means, they agreed to disagree at the end. And I don't think it's a healthy precedent to say, well, because it didn't work out that way, we are going to label you as supply chain risk. We are going to penalize you for not giving us what we want. I think that sets a very dangerous precedent to punish people over a contract dispute. There are ways to work out contract disputes that don't require that, where you can walk away with mutual respect. And so I understand why it gets heated when things like this happen. I don't think it's appropriate for the US government to label them basically something we would apply to like a foreign adversary, to say, basically, you didn't give us what we want, so therefore you are a threat to US goals. That to me is dangerous. And I think everybody should say, hey, not cool. Like, I don't care what side of the political aisle you sit on. You shouldn't be okay with that, because all that takes, that is a very dangerous precedent. And then all of a sudden that can be used when whoever's in power doesn't like where you land on a situation. And they say, you know what, we're just going to torpedo you commercially by making you basically radioactive. Nobody's going to want to touch you because you have this label assigned to you now. Now, I'm not saying it's going to put Anthropic out of business or anything like that, but I'm just saying I don't think it's appropriate to be vindictive when things don't go your way. And that's, to me, my interpretation of the overreach of labeling a supply chain. They're literally saying, we don't approve of it for this use case. That's what they're saying. That does not make them a threat to U.S. security or intelligence. That is in no way, shape, or form, in my opinion, a fair assessment. So I think that is not cool. As for Anthropic, I don't look at them as this hero who, is dying on a hill for doing what's right, even though I respect and agree with their position largely. At the same time, you did sign a deal with the Department of Defense that had already been rebranded the Department of War, by the way. So you knew what you were getting into. And I don't think it's okay to get into things with where it's like, come on, you know what the DoD does, you know what they do with their technology, you know what the whole purpose of the organization is. You're going to sign off on your technology being embedded into classified networks and then act shocked and appalled that the military wants to use it for operations and surveillance? No. Now, granted, like I said, I don't know all the details to how they got there, how all that stuff came together. So I'm not weighing in personal opinions on that. I'm just saying, let's not pretend that you didn't know that they might do this. Maybe you just over assumed on your, user policy and thought this will cover us. I don't know, but I'm saying, yeah, you can't cry foul when you do that. So I don't support Anthropic's approach there. As for Altman's maneuver, I don't trust the guy as far as I could throw him. So, and I know right now OpenAI is in a really bad spot and they're desperate for cash. So I don't think for a second his claim that, hey, we have the same policy, so our tech won't be used for these things. I promise. If he gets backed into a corner, I have no doubt that OpenAI will do whatever they're asked to keep the contract, to keep the money rolling in based on a pattern of consistent behavior. That's not a political statement. That's not my personal assessment of Sam Altman. That's just me watching what OpenAI has done and how consistently they've said, we will never. Actually, we're doing now. We will never this. Well, actually, now we're doing that exact same thing. And that's just a pattern. So I do at the same time recognize him not wanting tensions to rise between the government and AI. I'm not in his shoes. I don't have all the details. And while I personally don't know that I would take the same steps he is, probably would not, I do at least understand his strategy. In fact, all players involved, I understand where all of them are coming from, even if I don't agree with every single perspective, which is actually part of the focus of today, is to say, hey, let's focus on specifics and details. We can have our opinions, but then let's all work together to come to a mutually respectful and beneficial end. Okay, so there's my opinions on, in my opinion, the big matters. We could go back and forth on infinite details all day long, and I don't want to do that. Okay, so there you go. That's what's going on. There's a little bit more of my position on some of these big things. So now what? You've listened this far. We're 17, 18 minutes in, and you're like, okay, but I'm not in the Department of Defense. I'm not in one of these big tech companies. I'm just an organization or whatever. What am I supposed to take from this lesson? There's three things that came to mind for me that I think actually everybody can do. One of the things that is very clear from this is the lack of clear red lines that people have until they really get pressed. And I think this is a really unfortunate thing, is that many people just build a house on the beach at low tide and assume it'll be fine, thinking, I think I've built back far enough from the water's edge. It should be fine. And then the water starts rushing in and it leads to complete panic because you just weren't prepared for how things were going to go. And we have a tendency to want to stay open. We don't want to commit to anything, ethically or morally or even practical red lines, because who knows, there might be an opportunity we may be saying no to if we actually say these things. And unfortunately, what we're seeing through this is when we don't have clearly communicated red lines, it isn't flexibility. You're not leaving yourself open to opportunity. You're actually creating tremendous liability for you and your organization. When you go, well, we're just not really going to communicate this, or we're going to kind of keep it under the table and then we'll see how it plays out. You think you're protecting yourself, but you're actually creating a big mess for yourself in the long run. And unfortunately, if you don't have clear no's, and everything's we'll just wait and see, you have no time to prepare your response or prepare for how you're going to handle things or the PR blowback or all this stuff when it really gets pressed. And that is not a good place to be. So I would encourage everybody, whether you're doing this as an individual, whether you're doing this for your team or for your business or your business function. Do you know what your red lines are? Have you defined, hey, there are just some things, some areas we don't go. We don't go here. There's not exceptions to this. And if there are, we know exactly what they are and how far we're willing to go with them, type of a thing. Now, you may, if you've listened to me for very long, you may think, well, Christopher, we know where your red lines are. Ours are different. That's fine. I work with people all the time who have different red lines than me. My goal here is not to say you need to have the exact same red lines I do. What I'm saying is not having them and not having them clearly communicated, you are not doing yourself any favors. You are opening yourself up to massive liability and massive chaos. And you may not feel it when the tide's out, but when it comes rushing in, you're going to feel it big time. And if we're seeing anything right now in the world, it's that the tide is coming in. The tide is coming in and it's coming fast from all directions. And unfortunately, that's leaving a lot of people having to try and figure out things they thought were like just kind of understood, that's suddenly being pressed. Now, that ties to my second action. So the first action is like, look at, do you have them? Do you know what they are? Discuss these things. If it's personally, well, do the self-work. If it's with your team, talk about it with your team. Understand where the lines sit and make sure people know that they're there. And clear that. Like, think through, what are we going to do in the event something presses against that? Maybe they're not now. Great time to plan for it when the tide's out, not when it's rushing in. So the second one, though, is boilerplate is only boilerplate until it hits the fan. And I think many organizations, we all can get in this habit, especially when the tide's out. You might have some vague platitudinal red line, which is what we saw in this whole situation. Now, I'm not saying Anthropic's was vague. It was relatively clear, like, hey, we don't do this. But it's in a boilerplate UAP. How it got this far in the DoD, who knows? Maybe the salesperson just kind of like didn't really push hard on it. The DoD kind of just assumed it'll be fine. Everybody always kind of bends the rules when we come. We just figure out ways to work around. I don't know. I don't know exactly what happened. But that's the problem with having boilerplates and going, let's just kind of like avoid this conversation and hope it never comes up. Because then those red lines are useless. And it would have been very easy for Anthropic just to go, we're good. And this whole situation brought to mind a specific story for me where I remember early when I was doing some consulting work a number of years ago, I had an agreement. It was one of my first agreements, and I had written the terms and conditions, but I hadn't structured it in such a way. What if there was a leadership change? The gentleman who was in charge of the contract, we just kind of operated like, duh, of course you're going to be there. Like, of course you're going to be there. And then he wasn't. He was the CEO and he was unexpectedly removed. And then the new CEO came in and had very different views on not only what he wanted me to do moving forward, but paying for what I had done so far. And I didn't expect that. I didn't think to put that in the terms and it never crossed my mind. What if there's a leadership change? How would this be handled? And it resulted in a legal battle. So this goes back to, we often kind of gloss over terms and conditions. We gloss over things. We're like, it'll be fine. We don't really need to think about this. And sometimes it can feel like you're being you got a bee in your bonnet. If you're like, hey, we really need to like shore this up, make sure we have this discussion. We need to talk about this, make sure we're actually good with this. I want to actually redline this contract, make sure that everything in here is good to go. And I've dealt with that before where I've had very specific edits or tweaks to contracts that I have with companies. And they're like, what, dude, like, what are you so concerned about? I'm like, if it's not going to be a big deal, then let's just make the edit. I'm just doing this because it's burned me in the past. And every single one of you listening to this, you're going to have those opportunities, whether it's an agreement you have with an individual or a coworker, whether it's a formal contract you're signing in your organization, whether it's a vendor you're choosing to partner with, that generic language that just gets copy and pasted every single time and that you just make assumptions will always hold up. Now is a really good time to assess, hey, where are those things? Now, granted, that's why point one needs to happen first. You need to know what those red lines are so you can go, hey, are these things accounted for in our stuff so that it's communicated, so that we're covering ourselves legally? But then you actually need to go back and go, all right, where are those? Like, is it enough? Have we made that crystal clear as part of our process? Do we communicate that? Or do we just assume that because there's a signature on a piece of paper somewhere that we'll be fine? Have we actually had legal review this? Would it hold up in court, especially with how much things have changed? Now is a really good time to be making those adjustments, making, tweaks, adjustments. Like, do it during times of peacetime. Okay. It's a heck of a lot easier to make an adjustment to your contract or make an adjustment to an agreement that you have in place when things are fine and the relationship's great and, things are friendly. We can see from the Anthropic DoD thing, deciding you have a disagreement over things that maybe weren't discussed as deeply as they should have been doesn't go so well when you wait until things hit the fan and things blow up. All of a sudden you find yourself slapped with a supply chain risk for simply standing for something that was in your contract from the beginning. And that's why now is the time to go back and do those edits, do those reviews. The third and final one, though, is I understand firsthand and have been here many, many times. When your red lines get pressed, it is one of the most intimidating, scary, uncomfortable positions. And you can feel like it is holding the line when your red lines are getting pressed. I think it's part of one of the reasons we're so hesitant to actually draw them and communicate them. We'll draw them quietly behind, and we're like, yeah, we'll talk about it if it comes up. Instead of saying, no, here's my line. I'm just making that clear. Speak now or forever hold your peace. And we think we're doing a favor, but it's because it's scary when all of a sudden something brushes up. When the tide comes up and hits the seawall, you're like, did we put it where we need to? Is it going to hold? And often when things start hitting our red lines, we start to catastrophize what we think is going to happen. We think, oh boy, holding this line is going to be the absolute worst. And I'm sure Anthropic and the legal team and many other people, when the DoD started really hammering down and making threats and doing this other stuff, I'm sure there were lots of people that went, just bend, just give into it. We'll bury it. We'll hide it. We'll do all this other stuff. And so I actually have a lot of respect for Dario for saying, no, this is, and that you can disagree with his position, but in my opinion, you still have to respect the fact he said, this is what we said, and we're standing to it, and we're not going to back down on this just because it's not convenient for you. Now, I hope the Anthropic team went back and said, we need to reevaluate, how did we get this far? And now we're doing this. I absolutely hope they do that. But I think we all have to respect the fact that they set a line and they stuck to it. In a day when everybody seems to be willing to compromise and change what they think, what they believe, where they stand, depending on what they ate for breakfast or whatever sounds good in their own eyes in the moment. But I just know when you're faced with that, it is terrifying. It is terrifying, and it feels like the world will be over if you don't just compromise. And that's often why people push really hard when they hit your red lines, because they know where you're sitting and that you're in a very vulnerable position to compromise. I have had multiple experiences, but there is one in particular that stands out where it was literally if you don't compromise on this, we're calling HR and this is it. We're going to write up your exit papers. And I was not prepared for that. And when I stood my ground, I kept going, we're not going to get to this point. And it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying, but I stood my ground and they did too. And honestly, I thought this is the end of the world. I'm never going to recover from this. I'm done. I'm cooked. Like, end of the road. Take me out behind the shed, like Old Yeller. Like, I really thought this was it. And you know what? We moved forward. I'm still here. Things work out. Do you lose something? Sure. Of course you do. You know, is Anthropic going to take some heat from certain people because of their position? You bet they do. Are they the people that Anthropic probably wants as customers? Probably not. But look what else happened. Anthropic had such a huge influx of support and new agreements and all this other stuff. It shut down their servers. This just happened, I think, yesterday or last week or so. Anyway, whenever I'm recording this, it was like a little bit before. Like, they had such an influx. And that's the other thing to be encouraging. If you feel like standing your red lines is going to make you hated and despised and whatever, it's not. You know what? You're the people who stand by you. They're going to come through. And the ones that really were never there for you in the first place, that'll shake itself out as well. And in the end, you'll come out the other side. You will. Where you really lose is when you're willing to compromise on everything for any reason. And just as an example, look at OpenAI and Meta. Okay, those two companies have a reputation for doing whatever works best for them in the moment. They make a commitment and then they change their commitment. And they say they're not going to do this, and literally the next day they're doing it. And that may seem opportunistic. It may seem to get you somewhere in the short term. But when you refuse to stand for something, you end up standing for nothing. And right now, Anthropic seems to be winning the public support game, while OpenAI and the DoD are taking hits for their retaliation and their compromises. So while the pressure and the overwhelming sense of is heavy on actually taking a stand and saying, this is where I said I stood and I'm going to stand here. And if you choose to attack me, you choose to do whatever against me because you don't agree, I'm not going to back down. And I'm still going to be respectful and, you know, not hit back, but I'm not going to back down because you're demanding that I do. If you take that approach, it will do better for you in the long term. And so, you know, if you go through those first two exercises and you go, oh, this means we're going to have a conversation here, and you're nervous about it, I get it. And that's not easy. And if you need help, let me know. But you'll be fine. So in conclusion, hopefully that gives you three things. You know, one, define your red lines. Two, shore up where those red lines show up, and, you know, do it while peacetime's there, because it's a lot harder when things go crazy. And then third, if you're in a position where your red lines are pressed, or you know they will be pressed very soon, I understand the overwhelming fear, but stand firm. Yes, examine the lines you're standing on. You don't need to die on every hill. And sometimes we do plant red lines that are like, well, this was stupid. This was based on partial information. So reevaluate them. But if it's truly one of your red lines, don't back down just because you're feeling the pressure. You will regret that far more than whatever fallout you experience by holding it. But in conclusion with this, you know, I think the whole thing that makes me most disappointed in this situation is that my goal here isn't to say everybody always has to agree on everything. We can always kumbaya and come to a happy agreement at the end. Honestly, I see a world where all three of these players could have come out as winners and everything moved forward. The Pentagon could have respectably separated. They could have said, you know what? I understand where we respect that, Anthropic. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to continue moving forward with you for any sort of defense purposes because we need that. OpenAI could have, instead of said, we're doing the same thing Anthropic is, and we somehow, they could have came out and said, listen, we don't hold the same red lines Anthropic does. We're comfortable doing this. We're not saying we're just going to openly give them free access to this, but we're interpreting what that means, and we're a little more comfortable working in the gray there. And okay, you could disagree with them, but at least just be honest about where you stand. And Anthropic, they stood their ground clearly. They could have said, yeah, we know we're taking a hit. In the future, we won't make deals like this. We should have known better that this is probably where it was going to go. They all could have shook hands and walked away and still had different opinions, still not been on the same page. Public opinion would still be split, but everybody would have committed to doing their best given their own red lines. And I think that's what we all need to do. We can all have our red lines and they can all look a little bit different, but we can all walk away from the table and say, hey, I respect that yours are different, but that doesn't mean we got to beat each other up. So there you go. That's what I think we can all walk away from. Hopefully this helps you better understand the situation and challenges you to think about some of these things, because it is awful when you find yourself in these positions and you're ill prepared. And if, as you've been listening to this, you say, boy, I could really use some help figuring these things out. Like I said, you don't have to have the same red lines as me. I work all the time with people who I have very different red lines from. But it's about discovering what those are and defining the implications and then figuring out how to plan around those. So if you need help with that, get in touch. Links for all this stuff are in the show notes. You can reach out at any point. But I hope you found this helpful. And I'm Christopher Lynn. This has been Future Focus, and we will see you on the other side.